All right, so today I'll be briefly introducing the Huntington's Chinese Garden and then talking particularly about the place of calligraphy in the garden, as well as the first exhibition that will appear in the art gallery that is set to open at the end of August. I'll just start with a few slides of the garden for those of you who might not have visited. We're a fairly large Suzhou-style garden located in the middle of the Huntington Botanical Gardens. The Chinese garden is centered on a lake. It includes a number of pavilions and other structures, and it's kind of framed to the north by the San Gabriel Mountains. And because we're located in the middle of a botanical garden with quite lush foliage, unlike in many traditional style gardens in China, basically everything except the natural scenery is screened from view in our garden. So you get a very kind of natural view that you don't necessarily get in many classical gardens in China. The entirety of the garden was constructed in collaboration between American construction companies and Chinese artisans. Most of the materials were brought over from China. The garden itself was designed by Chinese architects and designers. And then American crews did a lot of the foundation work and grading, and Chinese crews did the detail work that really makes the garden so special. The garden includes both native California flora as well as a representative selection of Chinese plants. In fact, the origin of the garden lay in the desire to show Americans where many of the plants in their backyard came from, which turns out to be China. So peonies, roses, chrysanthemums, many flowering fruit trees all have their origin in China, but they've been incorporated into American gardens for at least the past 100 years. And then this is just one final view that gives you some sense of the scale of the garden and its surroundings. We now have a pavilion that overlooks the entirety of the garden and then includes this quite amazing view onto the San Gabriel Mountains to the north. So on the left, you see a map of the garden, which is now about 15 acres in total. It's quite large. It was conceived between the 1980s and 1990s, but was constructed in over a 16-year period between 2004 and 2020. And the final phase of the garden just opened last fall. Because of COVID restrictions, some of the interior spaces that we had intended to open in October of 2020 are just now beginning to open. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So what I'd like to focus on today is, not surprisingly, the place of calligraphy in the garden. And I think probably one of the things that, at least for Euro-American visitors, that's most surprising about visiting a Chinese garden is that there's text all over the place. And actually, when you first come to the main entrance to the Chinese garden, this is what you see, this gray tile-framed doorway set into a white plaster wall and surmounted by a black tile roof. That color palette and those materials actually tell a visitor that this is a garden specifically inspired by the gardens of Suzhou in southeastern China. And to a certain degree, these materials and color palette also suggest that this garden is taking particular inspiration from gardens of the 16th and 17th centuries. But probably for a Chinese reading or Chinese speaking visitor, the most important thing on this doorway is actually the inscription that appears over the top. This is a close-up of the inscription. It's rendered again in gray tile. The characters have been brought out with a kind of, I actually don't know what the material is, but it's a kind of sparkling black rock that creates quite brilliant lighting effects and that really makes the characters legible. And what this inscription does is quite simply tell you the name of the garden. It says Liu Fangyuan, the garden of flowing fragrance. Like the names of many gardens in China, and like the names of many sites within gardens, this name has a double reference. On the one hand, there's the obvious reference to the context of the botanical gardens, where there are fragrances flowing constantly, and also where there was once, at least in the area where the Chinese garden is, where there was once a flowing stream of water. But the name has a second layer of reference, and that is to a historical work of literature. The phrase flowing fragrance was actually taken from a 3rd century poem about a goddess who personifies a river in central China, the Luo River. And in this long poem that describes the beauty of the goddess, she is described as treading in the pungency of pepper plant paths, stepping through spikenard clumps, making their fragrance flow. And so when the garden was named, I think around 2004 or so, our founding curator of the garden, Jun Li, I think really liked this image of people kind of walking through the flora and being perfumed in fragrance. And so that became a kind of image for what we hoped visitors might experience when they came to the Chinese garden itself. So let's take a closer look at the inscription. The inscription is not just simply those 3 main characters. The 3 main characters do tell you the name of the garden. They're read from right to left. And again, it just simply says flowing fragrance garden. But you might also note that to the left and the right of that main inscription are inscriptions in smaller characters. And it turns out that the one on the right is a date. It says the 1st month of spring in 2007. And the inscription on the left is a signature. It says Wango Wang of Haiyu. And I'm not sure if you can make it out, but there are also 2 small seals included with the signature. So, of course, what these smaller inscriptions do is tell us when this piece of writing was executed, and they also tell us who executed it. In this case, Wango Wang was a very important collector of Chinese art. He was the descendant of a tutor to the Empress Dowager Cixi of China. And his ancestor, Wang Tonghe, amassed one of the largest and most important private collections of Chinese painting in the 19th century. That collection was passed down through the Wang family to Wango, who immigrated to the US first in the 1930s to attend Purdue University, and then eventually he came here permanently after the revolution in 1949. And he devoted his life to promoting Chinese culture in the US. He made a number of documentaries, he curated exhibitions, he wrote books, and eventually he gave his family's painting collection to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. He also gave his own research collection of books to the Huntington Library. And so the Huntington essentially invited him to write this inscription, the name of the garden, in 2007. And I think it's very fitting. Mr. Wang was sort of the last, almost like the last of the literati of China. And it seems very appropriate that he would write the most important inscription for our garden. Of course, what all of this, what these components of the inscription suggest is that before the inscription existed as carved tiles, it was originally a work of calligraphy on paper. And so I'm showing you in the bottom here an image of what Mr. Wang's calligraphy looked like. So to create the actual tile inscription, Mr. Wang first wrote the inscription in ink on paper, and then that inscription was scanned or photographed. The files were sent to our partners in China, who then carved the tiles to create the inscription that now appears over the garden entryway. So if we go back to this main entryway, once you know a little bit more about the inscription, it kind of indicates to you as a visitor that the space that you're about to enter obviously is a Chinese garden. It's obviously a Suzhou style garden, but probably more importantly, it's a space in which the natural world, or at least the landscape of the garden, is being imbued with literary and cultural references, as well as which are expressed through the art of calligraphy. Besides tile names, the other important kind of calligraphy that we have in the garden are calligraphic couplets. So a couplet is kind of like a fragment, a two-line fragment of poetry. And these couplets typically are rendered in wooden placards. So here you see an image of a thatched hut that's in a small canyon just below the Chinese garden, linking the Chinese and Japanese gardens. And on the two front pillars of the pavilion, you can see that there are these there is this wooden couplet. If we zoom in a little bit, you can read the couplet, and it's read from top to bottom, right to left. So it reads, "Flowing water can purify the mind, fragrant mountains suit quiet contemplation." So the first thing you might notice is that the first two characters, or the first character of each line of the couplet, is actually taken from the name of the garden, flowing and fragrance. And then you might also note that each character or word in this couplet is parallel from one line to the other. So the first words in each couplet are both adjectives. The second words are both nouns. The third words are both auxiliary verbs. And then the fourth and fifth characters in each line create a kind of verbal phrase. Typically, couplets also will have another kind of parallelism in terms of the tones of the characters. As probably everyone knows, all dialects of Chinese are tonal languages. And in a very strictly constructed couplet, there will be a kind of complementary parallelism in the tones of each character. This particular couplet doesn't have that quite perfectly. The couplet itself, much like Mr. Wang's inscription, is signed and dated, and in this case, it is signed as being written by Shi Tingquan in the lotus month of the Dinghai year, which was June of 2007. Shi Tingquan is the pseudonym of Richard Strasberg, who is a recently retired professor of Chinese literature at UCLA. Professor Strasberg not only did the calligraphy for this inscription, but he also composed the poem. And he served on a kind of he continues to serve on an advisory committee for our garden. So when you actually experience the couplet within the garden setting and think about its meaning, you kind of immediately understand that it's meant to be an invitation to you as a visitor, first to listen to the sound of the stream that's flowing beside this pavilion, and to perhaps use the sound of that stream to somehow purify your mind. But also it's an invitation to appreciate the hills, or the hills that surround the valley into which this thatched hut is set. And as you can see in the upper left-hand corner of the photograph, the main garden is just barely visible, as though it's perched on top of a mountain. So the couplet was written both to fit the site of this thatched hut itself, but also to kind of provide a mental framework for visitors to inhabit when they experience the site. And then there's one other kind of material that we commonly use for inscriptions in the Chinese garden, and that is stone. And here you're seeing a photograph of part of a site called the Court of Assembled Worthies. The inscription is rendered on a large rock. Essentially all of the rocks in our garden came from China, specifically from the region of Lake Tai, which is near Shanghai and Suzhou in eastern China. It's a kind of limestone that's particularly valued for its unusual forms, including lots of holes. This particular inscription, of course, existed as a work on paper before it was carved. And the inscription was written by Fushan, who is both a practicing calligrapher as well as an art historian, who's primarily based in Taiwan, but he received his PhD in art history at Princeton. He worked as a curator in the US for a little while. And he's been active as an art historian and calligrapher in China and Taiwan. I should have said earlier, actually, Richard Strasberg, of course, wrote his couplet by hand, but he actually didn't sign the couplet. The main couplet itself was done in a couple of different pieces, and all of that was pieced together digitally and then carved into wood. So I wanted to show you this inscription in particular because I have at least one photograph of how the whole thing was carved. So after Fushan wrote his calligraphy, we scanned it and then sent it again to our partners in China. And then when they came on site, they actually just simply used a black and white printer to print the characters at different sizes. And after we had selected the rock on which the inscription would appear, we played around with different sizes of characters. And then they just simply used Scotch tape or something to put the characters onto the rock, and eventually used either a Dremel or some sort of pneumatic drill to render the inscription, to engrave the inscription. And then they only engrave it to a very shallow depth. It's maybe a 16th or an 1/8 of an inch at most. And the final step, of course, is to fill it in with pigment. In this case, the artisans actually even tried to replicate some of the effects of the calligraphy brush, including what's called flying white, which is that effect where you kind of see the bristles of the brush start to separate and you have less of a full kind of completely dark stroke, and you begin to get a sense of the motion of the brush. You'll also note that the artisans did render all of the seals that appeared on the original piece of calligraphy. And they do that by first kind of smoothing the section of the rock where those seals will appear and then engraving them very, very finely. So again, when you experience this inscription within the context of the garden, in a sense that it resembles something a little bit like graffiti appearing on a natural feature. But because these inscriptions are rendered so elegantly and because they appear only in very specific spots, you immediately get the sense that they're kind of naming a whole section of the garden. In this case, the name was chosen because this courtyard is meant to be used for musical performances. The pavilion that you can see in the background was designed as a kind of stage for opera. And we chose the name Court of Assembled Worthies because that was the name that was used to refer in pre-modern periods to the assembly of scholars who would advise, for example, advise an emperor. And so our hope was that when people assembled here for performances, they would feel as though they too were these lofty worthies. So ultimately, these different kinds of inscriptions that appear throughout the garden, and in total, there are about 90 different inscriptions, about 60 names, and 20 or 30 different couplets. They're really meant to imbue the landscape with cultural and literary references. As I've discussed, they're also meant to frame visitors' perception of the sites. And ultimately, they're kind of meant to signal the Huntington's educational mission. We tried to choose names and couplets. We tried to draw these names and couplets from works of literature from throughout Chinese history. So the sort of earliest names that we have appear or are originally found in books like the Book of Rites or the Zhuangzi, which were written 2,500 years ago. And we also have names and couplets that are taken from more recent works of literature, like the Qing Dynasty novel, The Dream of the Red Chamber. And to make all of this accessible, we've created a map of all of the inscriptions in the garden. It's a digital map that actually I'll try to show it to you briefly. Here it is. So we've created this digital map of the garden. In this box on the right, you can see the map. And every one of these dots is a particular inscription. And so when you click on a dot, you're able to see a photograph of the inscription on site, as well as the original work of calligraphy. And then we've also provided information about the artist, a description of some of the works. We've provided a biography of the artist, and then we've also translated all of the additional inscriptions and seals that appear on the work. And finally, we've given some indication of how the name of the site was chosen. So what I'd like to talk about next is how we kind of thematize calligraphy as an art form in the garden. As part of the expansion that opened in October of 2020, we included a structure called the Flowery Brush Library, which is designed as a kind of replica of a scholar's studio. In other words, the kind of space in which a garden owner would have written poetry or created paintings or brushed calligraphy. And actually this whole scholar's studio really is meant to thematize the practice of brush arts. The name of the building itself, Flowery Brush or Brush Flower, has a number of different meanings. First, brush flower is a kind of nickname for magnolia blossoms in China because the unopened bud of a magnolia resembles the tip of a brush used for writing or painting. There's also a phrase in Chinese, 梦笔生花, dreaming of a brush producing flowers, which is a kind of idiom that's used to describe someone who it is assumed will go on to have great literary achievement. There's a story of a young scholar who one night is dreaming about either writing poetry or taking an exam. And rather than producing words, his brush produces flowers from its tip. And then also there's a site called the Magnolia Hall, which is actually the main hall in the Humble Administrator's Garden in Suzhou. It was a hall that was supposedly used by a great calligrapher and painter of the 16th century, Wen Zhengming, when he was in temporary residence in the garden. So the name of our scholar's studio has these 3 layers of reference. And we, again, invited a rather important calligrapher, Fu Shen, whom I introduced briefly earlier, to write the name placard for the building. And he actually came to the Huntington in August of 2018 to write that placard. I have a short video that I will try to show. I think it will be very blurry or jerky, but hopefully you'll be able to get at least some sense of the kind of dynamism with which he writes. When he came to the Huntington, he was 81 years old, and he is in terms of his health, he's very frail, but as soon as he picks up a brush, he writes with just amazing confidence and force. And you'll be able to see how, with this final stroke, just how dynamically he manipulates the brush. As I mentioned, he received his PhD at Princeton, and his dissertation actually focused on a calligrapher whose calligraphic style became a model for Fu Shen's own calligraphy. Let's see. So the interior of the Flowery Brush Library, as I said, is meant to replicate the kind of artistic studio space of a pre-modern Chinese garden owner. We commissioned a variety of furniture and scholars' objects to fill the space. And eventually, the idea is that docents will facilitate interactions with visitors in this space, and they'll actually lead them through the process of, trying to write or paint with a brush, or perhaps having tea, or practicing different kinds of musical instruments. Unfortunately, because of COVID restrictions, we still haven't opened the interior of the space to the public, but we're hoping to be able to do so this fall. For the moment, visitors can just simply look into the space to see how we've set it up. So I'd now like to move to one of the other important spaces in which we display calligraphy in the garden, and that is a new art gallery that will be opening in August of this year. It's located immediately behind the Flowery Brush Library. The space is called the Studio for Lodging the Mind, and it really was designed as a kind of contemporary, light-controlled, climate-controlled art gallery. This is just a close-up of the name placard. And we chose the name for this space from an essay written in the 11th century on art collecting. And in this case, the person who wrote this essay, Susha, was invited by his friend to write an essay to commemorate his friend's painting collection. And Susha responded a bit ironically to the commission, and rather than simply celebrating the greatness of his friend's painting collection, he instead said, maybe you shouldn't be quite so obsessed with painting. It's great that you collect it, but please be sure that you don't allow that collection to dominate your life. And so Susha actually opens his essay by saying, a gentleman may lodge the mind in things, but he should not leave his mind in things. And then he goes on to say, if he lodges the mind in things, then even trivial things will be sufficient to delight him, but rare things will not be sufficient to render him ill. If he leaves his mind in things, then even trivial things will render him ill, while even rare things will not be sufficient to delight him. So given Susha's insistence that you should take delight in objects, but not allow them to completely obsess you, we thought that might be a fitting name for an art gallery in which we would primarily be showing just temporary exhibitions. And we invited again an art historian and calligrapher named Bai Qiansheng, who formerly taught at Boston University and now teaches at Zhejiang University in China, to write the name placard. And Bai Qiansheng is also someone whose research focuses on the history of calligraphy, but who himself is a very accomplished calligrapher. And it's in this space that we're going to be mounting our first exhibition called A Garden of Words, the Calligraphy of Liu Fangyuan. The exhibition will open in August of this year, on August 28th. And the first rotation will last until mid-December, and then we have a second rotation of objects that will open on January 29th, and will be up until May 16th. So I'll show you I'm just going to be showing you objects from the first rotation today. The exhibition is organized around 4 themes. It's really meant to just introduce the art of calligraphy to visitors, and to kind of provide some basic knowledge so that you can walk through the garden and have a deeper engagement with the calligraphy itself. So we focus on the content of calligraphy, the materials that are used to create it, the different forms or script types that are found in the garden, and ultimately the futures of this art form. So we begin with content, and we just use a single inscription to talk about how calligraphy communicates meaning. And in this case, it's an inscription for a site called the Forest Fragrance Court. And what's nice about this inscription is that each of these 3 characters communicates in a different way. So the first character, forest or lin, is actually a pictograph. It shows two trees together, and so therefore it connotes a grove or a forest. The second character is xiang, or fragrance, which in its modern form is more or less an ideograph. There's an upper component that depicts a kind of grain, and a lower component that actually is meaningless. It doesn't indicate either meaning or sound, but an earlier variant of this character combined grain with a component that indicated sweetness. And so consequently, grain plus sweetness was meant to connote the deliciousness or fragrance of that grain, particularly grain that might have been used in brewing alcohol or fermenting alcohol. And then the final character, yuan, or court, includes one component that signifies meaning. The part on the left is a kind of abstracted representation of mounds or hills. And the component on the right is pronounced wan. And so that component is meant to signify to the reader that this character as a whole should be pronounced similarly to wan. So when you put those two parts together, you end up with a character that means a space surrounded by walls or hills, and that is pronounced like wan. In this case, it's pronounced yuan, or in the modern pronunciation, it's pronounced yuan. So in short, with this three-character inscription, you have three different kinds of characters, each of which communicates meaning in a slightly different way. And we thought it was important to begin with an inscription like this because, at least among many English speakers, it's assumed that Chinese characters are somehow just simply pictographic. But in fact, they use a variety of techniques to communicate meaning, and the vast majority of Chinese characters indicate both sound and meaning. We also have produced some graphic or interpretive materials that indicate how characters are written. So in this case, we simply have a representation of the order in which the strokes of these particular characters are written. So the second part of the exhibition focuses on materials, brush, ink sticks, paper, and ink stones. And we tried to choose inscriptions or pieces of calligraphy that exemplified the great variety of effects that calligraphers can achieve by using the very same materials, but just manipulating them in slightly different ways, or by choosing a slightly different kind of paper, or a slightly different kind of ink, or a slightly softer or slightly harder brush. So we begin with a comparison between two works. The inscription on the left, it reads, "Listening to the pines," and the one on the right is "Jeweled Blossoms Slope." And you can see immediately that even though these are both just works of ink on paper, they appear very, very different because different kinds of paper and different kinds of ink were used. And that becomes even clearer if we look at a close-up, where you can see on the left that the artist has chosen a paper that has a very loose structure. And he's also chosen to write with ink that's been quite heavily diluted. So when the ink touches the paper, it suffuses in kind of chaotic and unpredictable ways. And I think he did that quite intentionally to evoke something like the lichens or the moss that are growing on the trunks and branches of the pine trees that are evoked in the content of the inscription. And then on the right, the calligrapher has written on paper that's much more densely structured, and he's written with ink that's probably a bit thicker. And so that allows him to create much smoother, more solid contours. We also, in this section of the exhibition, decided to exhibit a work of calligraphy such that you could see both the front and the back of the piece of paper. And the reason we wanted to do that is that if you look at a piece of calligraphy or a painting from the front, you often get the sense that everything is quite smooth and very clear. But if you look at the back of the calligraphy, you get some insights into where the calligrapher began each stroke, where he paused as he was writing, where he or she speeded up their stroke, that sort of thing. And so we worked with a designer to develop a kind of double-sided display mechanism so that visitors would see the inscription first from the front and then would be able to walk around to the back and see the back of the inscription. And so again, to show a close-up, you can see on the right the way the character, again, it's the character xiang, or fragrance, how it appears from the front. It seems to be fairly smoothly, solidly rendered. But if you look at it from the back, you can see that, for example, in this stroke that's on the right of the back side, he begins with this very small head of the stroke and then kind of quickly moves his brush and then slows down a little bit and probably moves it a bit more hesitatingly until he gets to the end when there's this final dot. Or you can see something similar going on with the stroke in the middle of the bottom section of the character, as well as in the long horizontal stroke in the middle of the character. So we just simply hope that being able to look at both the front and the back of the inscription and being able to compare those two, the two sides of the inscription, would provide visitors with some insights into the process of writing that they might not typically get in exhibitions of calligraphy. And then the final inscription in this section is a work that we use to exemplify all of the textual materials that appear in a single inscription. So in this case, it's a couplet that dominates most of the two scrolls. But the artist has also indicated where this couplet originally came from. In this case, it was a couplet that was created by an 18th century painter, Jin Nong, who's also known as Mr. Wintry Heart, Dongxin Xianzheng. Then the next inscription is the date and the artist's signature. It was written on a summer day in 2018 by an artist named Tang Qingyan. And then finally, there are three seals on the inscription, and we've translated those. So in a sense, this couplet has all of the textual materials that a calligrapher might choose to incorporate into an inscription. Often calligraphers will omit the original source of the calligraphy. Sometimes they might choose to omit the date. Sometimes they might vary the number of seals, but this is a pretty complete inscription. And then the third section of the exhibition focuses on the different forms or script types of calligraphy. And these are, I should have said this at the beginning, but all of the works incorporated into this exhibition are works from the garden. They're the original works on paper from which the inscriptions in the garden were produced. And we're fortunate in that we do have works that represent all 5 major script types that are commonly recognized in calligraphy today. So we begin with seal script, which is a kind of archaic form of writing that actually has its origins about 4,000 years ago. It became more formalized, well, not 4,000, 3,000 years ago. It became a bit more formalized, 2,500 and 2,200 years ago. But calligraphers will play with kind of different moments in the history of seal script to create their inscriptions. In this case, the artist has chosen to use a very early model of seal script, a kind of writing that's adapted from actual incisions or engravings into bone or tortoise shell that were used in divinations. And that kind of writing may well have originally been written by brush, but it was then engraved with a stylus. And so when calligraphers today write in that style, they really emphasize the kind of sharp linearity of each stroke. There were later examples of seal script, like that which was the model for this inscription, that were, again, originally written by brush and then carved into stone steles. And again, the artist has kind of emphasized the symmetrical structures of the character. He's emphasized the relatively thin, even lines of the characters, all of which is quite characteristic of seal script. Seal script is really meant to give you a sense of archaic, not necessarily ruggedness, but archaism, sometimes a sense of sort of ruggedness. It's meant to feel quite powerful and ancient. And I think you really get that sense almost immediately by looking at something like this. The second of the major script types historically is called clerical script. It was developed as a faster means of writing than seal script. Seal script requires quite slow, or it can require quite slow execution. Clerical script can be written a bit faster, and as the name implies, it was probably developed by governmental scribes who had to copy large numbers of documents and therefore needed a faster means of writing. It tends to be characterized by the kind of horizontally wider structure of the characters, by these quite dramatic flares on the tails of certain strokes, like these horizontal strokes or the diagonal strokes. It often will include quite dramatic modulation of individual strokes. So for example, in this inscription, each of these diagonals begins almost with a hair-thin line, and then they expand into these dramatic trumpets and trumpet-like finishes. And all of that is done by very carefully modulating the pressure that the calligrapher applies to the brush. This is kind of a special inscription in that it's actually the oldest inscription that we have in the garden. It was rendered in 1982. And so of course it wasn't specifically rendered for the Chinese garden, but the artist who created it, Louis Tai, was originally from Hong Kong, but she emigrated to the US in the 1980s and became a very well-respected calligraphy teacher and practitioner in the San Francisco Bay Area. And one of her students ended up connecting us with her, and she gave us this couplet, which we've now had engraved into a placard that will appear within the scholar's studio. So the third commonly recognized form of or type of calligraphy is regular script, which actually historically matured the latest, even though it ended up becoming the kind of writing that is most commonly used in China today. And you can see the characters have a kind of square structure. The strokes are very clearly legible. Sometimes strokes will have quite a lot of modulation, sometimes not. But it's meant to feel very formal, kind of solemn and stately. It actually isn't used that often in gardens because it's sometimes considered a bit too formal and a bit too stately. It's more common to see it for the names of government buildings or for the names of halls and temples or monasteries and places like that. This particular work was done by a well-regarded art historian just 2 years before he died. He was 93 when he wrote this, and yet still very actively practicing calligraphy. A kind of abstracted form of regular script is known as running script. It's a bit more cursive, it's a bit freer. It's the kind of script that people typically use when they're writing their own poetries, or maybe when they're writing a letter to a friend. It's a kind of script that's still relatively legible, but able to be written a bit faster and a bit more freely than something like regular script. And you can see from this inscription the kind of additional fluidity with which the artist renders the strokes. Often strokes, rather than being separated, strokes will be linked together by very fine movements of the brush, but every character typically is separate from one another. And running script probably has the greatest diversity of forms of any style of any script form. It can range from characters that are almost indistinguishable from regular script to very abstracted cursive characters that practically seem to be a kind of cursive. This is, again, I think, a particularly beautiful example of running script rendered by Terry Yuen, who's a calligrapher in the San Gabriel Valley near Los Angeles. And I just would point out that one of the things that makes this inscription so remarkable is that he, for example, the same character components or radicals appear in multiple characters in the inscription. And yet he figures out a way of rendering every one of these radicals slightly differently. So you might look at the third character on the right, the fourth character on the right, and then the third character on the left. And if you look at the bottom component of that character, you can see the remarkable variation with which he renders each of those components. And similarly, if you look at the next to last character on the right, you can see that there are about 8 different horizontal lines in that single character, and yet he's rendered every one of those horizontal lines differently. And it's because of all of that variation that's, in a sense, very carefully calculated, but it's also partially the result of chance when he's actually sitting down to write the calligraphy. It's because of that variation that he's able to fill the inscription with so much dynamism and energy. And you might even note that within each individual column of calligraphy, there's an incredible amount of movement just from character to character, as well as movement within each character itself. And then finally, there is cursive script, which is abstracted almost to the point of being illegible, at least to people who haven't trained in calligraphy. I can very rarely read cursive script, but at the very least, I think most people can appreciate it instantly as an almost abstract form of art. Of course, it's not really abstract. It is legible to people who actually practice it and have trained in it. And we have 2 examples of cursive script in the exhibition. The second example is actually by a guy from New York who ended up making his career in China as a photographer and now lives there full time. And he began initially learning calligraphy just as kind of something he might be able to add to his photographic works, but in fact, he's also become a very accomplished calligrapher in his own right. And the final section of the exhibition focuses on the possible futures of calligraphy. In other words, the ways that calligraphers are trying to innovate within the bounds of their tradition. Some of the calligraphers that we've commissioned try to return calligraphy to its kind of mythical or pictographic origins. This artist named Luo Qing, you can see it with the middle character, which means cloud. He quite literally tries to render that character as though it were a cloud filled with rain, showering on the landscape below. He really approaches calligraphy as though it were a form of painting. And not surprisingly, Luo Qing is a well-regarded painter as well as a poet. Another calligrapher named Zhu Chengjun often will try to harmonize the form of his calligraphy with the content of the inscriptions. And he, in this inscription, it reads, "Pick a flower and smile, face the wine and sing." And it seems as though he takes that notion of facing the wine and sing quite literally. It's as though he's written this particular inscription while he was a bit tipsy and was having a great deal of fun as he was writing. And then finally, an artist named Tang Qingnian actually will look to past forms of writing that have largely been forgotten and will use those forms of writing as new models for calligraphy. So In this case, he's resurrected a kind of writing called bird and worm script that first emerged about 2,500 years ago, and that subsequently was not written very frequently, although it was sometimes used on seals. And Tang Qingnian has chosen to use this particular script type as a kind of new model for his own calligraphy. For the exhibition, we also produced a couple of videos, one a demonstration video that shows how the same character is written in different styles, and it really allows visitors to see the very clear motions of the calligrapher's brush when writing in these different styles. And then we also produced an interview video. We interviewed 8 of the artists whose works appear in the exhibition and talked to them about their processes of creation. So just to conclude very quickly, I'll just show you some photographs of the installation process. As I said, the exhibition opens on August 28th. And actually over the course of about 3 months, we're installing the exhibition. The gallery itself is just an empty white box. And so we worked with a designer to create a kind of display mechanism so that we would have a little bit more wall space to show the works of calligraphy. And what he came up with was a very interesting lattice structure that you'll see in just a moment. This is the title wall. The first thing that you see is that as you enter the gallery, and then as you begin walking around, you see on the right side this lattice structure that's completely modular, and that it allows us to both hang artworks and to show text panels. But because of the lattice, there's also some kind of transparency or translucency, so that it doesn't feel as though you're simply standing inside of a solid cube. And the lattice work designs were adapted from some of the lattices and the window lattices in the exterior garden. This gives you a good sense of what those lattice panels are like. And as I said, it's a modular display system, so we'll be able to use it for multiple exhibitions in the future. This is taking us into just, as you can see, we haven't actually installed any of the works of calligraphy themselves yet. We simply have the cases and some of the vinyl texts on the wall. The artworks will be installed closer to the opening date in August. And then this space is where we'll be showing the interview videos. There's a kind of video chamber in which we'll be able to view the interviews. So that's just a very brief preview of what to look forward to when you visit the gallery in person. As I said, the exhibition opens August 28th, and it will be the first exhibition in this space. So we're very, very excited to be able to open it. And I really hope that it will help visitors to the garden better appreciate the inscriptions that really fill the entirety of Liufengyuan. So with that, I'm very happy to take any questions you might have. And thank you all very much for your attention.